picture this. You are a rebel commander in the 15th century BCE.
Right.
You're holding this heavily fortified city called Megiddo, which is in what is today northern Israel.
Yeah, a major stronghold.
Exactly. And you know the Egyptian army is coming for you. I mean, you know they have to cross this massive mountain range to reach you.
Right, which is a logistical nightmare for an ancient army.
Totally. So you're smart. You've heavily guarded the two wide, safe, easily traversable roads that go around the mountains. It's the obvious tactical play, right?
The only logical play if you're thinking by the book.
Exactly. But what you don't know is that the Egyptian pharaoh, Thutmose III, has decided to just completely ignore all of his generals.
Yeah, he just throws the playbook out the window.
He really does. He chooses a third route. Like this tiny mountain goat path that is so narrow that his tens of thousands of soldiers and his war chariots have to travel single file.
Which is insanely dangerous.
Right. If you had posted even like a handful of archers at the top of that pass,
Yeah.
you could have wiped out the greatest military power of the ancient world in an afternoon, just completely destroyed them.
But you did it.
But you didn't. So Thutmose pours into the valley, completely surprises your forces, and, well, fundamentally alters the course of history.
I mean, it really is one of the most audacious military gambles ever recorded.
Yeah.
And it perfectly encapsulates the kind of history we're unpacking today. Because, we often fall into this trap of thinking about the history of warfare as a neat, linear progression.
Like a straight line.
Right. Like you unlock bronze, and then you unlock iron, and then you get standing armies, and history just marches forward like a predictable video game technology tree.
Yeah, like civilization is just leveling up.
Exactly.
Right.
But the reality is, the reality is a chaotic, incredibly pragmatic scramble for survival.
And that scramble is exactly what we're exploring today. Welcome to the deep dive. We are taking a massive, comprehensive look at the pre-colonial military history of Africa.
Specifically focusing on North and West Africa.
Right, from ancient times all the way up to around 1870. And we are using Timothy J. Stapleton's incredibly dense academic text, A Military History of Africa, to help us cut through the information overload.
It's a fantastic resource for this.
It really is. Our mission here is to understand the mechanics of these empires. Like, how did the environment, the trade routes, and imported technology actually work on the ground to shape human civilization over 4,000 years?
And the challenge with reconstructing this specific past is the source material itself.
Which is always tricky with ancient history.
Right, but especially here. Historians studying pre-colonial Africa rely heavily on a combination of limited written records and extensive oral traditions.
Which are super important culturally.
Oh, absolutely fascinating and deeply culturally significant. But academically, they're generally considered historically accurate only up to about 250 years ago.
Oh, wow. Only 250 years.
Yeah, usually. Before that, the timeline can compress, or events become heavily mythologized. And this creates a deeply distorted view of the continent's history.
Because different regions have different types of records.
Exactly. Because of early contact with the Mediterranean and the Middle East, North Africa has thousands of years of meticulously recorded written history.
Right, we have so much documentation for Egypt.
Yeah, but in contrast, vast regions of West Africa, which hosted empires of equal or even greater complexity, have a much shorter documented timeline.
Which means we really have to piece together the mechanics of these societies using whatever archaeological and historical fragments we have.
It's a lot of detective work.
It is. Okay, let's unpack this. But before we get into the weeds of how these armies function, I do need to make a quick note about the nature of our source text today.
Because it gets pretty dark.
Very dark. Stapleton's book covers the absolute darkest corners of human ambition. I mean, we are going to be detailing brutal campaigns of conquest.
The horrific economic machinery of both the trans-Saharan and Atlantic slave trades.
Right. Centuries of colonization and wars of religious expansion, including various jihads.
It's heavy material.
It is. So I want to be clear. Our mission here is purely analytical. We are impartially reporting the historical facts and events exactly as they are presented in this academic source material.
We aren't here to take sides or pass modern moral judgment.
Exactly. Or endorse any political or ideological viewpoints. We are simply conveying the reality of the historical record to understand the mechanics of how these societies operated.
And understanding those mechanics really has to start with dismantling one of the biggest misconceptions about ancient warfare.
The idea of the standing army.
Right. European historians for a very long time judged African militaries by a strict Western standard.
Like they were looking for Roman legions.
Exactly. They looked for professional standing armies, men who lived in barracks, trained year-round, and did absolutely nothing but soldiering.
If they didn't see that,
They often assumed these societies were militarily unsophisticated, but they completely missed the brutal, pragmatic genius of the seasonal militia.
the myth of the standing army.
Yeah.
Because in most pre-colonial African societies, there was virtually no distinction between a civilian and a soldier.
None at all.
Right, if you were a farmer, a cattle herder, or a fisherman, you were also the military. When a campaign was called, you just picked up your weapons.
And the reason for this wasn't some lack of organization. It was an absolute submission to the dictates of geography and environment.
Geography dictates everything.
It really was the ultimate general. Think about the vast open savannas of the Sahel, that semi-arid region stretching across Africa just south of the Sahara.
Right, wide open spaces.
Yeah, that landscape favored mobility, which meant cavalry. You had wide open plains where horses could easily maneuver.
But if you go south,
Right. If you move further south into the dense coastal forests of West Africa, horses are entirely useless.
because they just can't move through the thick undergrowth.
Exactly. So in the forests, you see the development of highly specialized infantry and naval warfare utilizing these massive war canoes on the river systems.
And the logistics of moving these armies were a nightmare. I mean, we take supply chains for granted today, right?
Oh, modern logistics are a marvel.
But these seasonal militias didn't have massive wagon trains of preserved food following them around. They literally lived off the land.
Which is terrifying for anyone living nearby.
Right. An army on the march was basically a localized plague of locusts. They would sweep through a territory, foraging and consuming every single scrap of food.
Which routinely caused localized famines.
And that didn't just happen to the enemies. I mean, an army marching through its own territory just to get to the front lines could devastate its own people's food supply.
Which brings a deeply practical element to the spiritual side of warfare.
How so?
Well, these campaigns weren't taken lightly. Armies were ritually prepared, blessed, and spiritually purified before marching out.
Hope to bond them together.
Yeah, it served to psychologically bond these farmers into a cohesive fighting unit. But once they actually got on the battlefield, the tactics were incredibly conservative regarding human life.
They weren't looking for massive casualties.
No, total annihilation of the enemy was rarely the goal. They relied heavily on espionage, intimidation, and complex flanking maneuvers.
Basically trying to force the enemy to rout without a bloodbath.
Exactly. The primary goal of a campaign was usually the acquisition of resources, cattle, captives, or control of a trade route, not a massive bloody slaughter.
Okay, I have to push back on the idea that this is a superior system, though.
Oh,
Yeah, I understand the environmental adaptation, but isn't a seasonal militia inherently weaker than a standing army?
in what sense?
Well, think about a modern volunteer fire department in a rural town. Those men and women are highly motivated, they know the terrain perfectly, and they are deeply integrated into the community.
Right, which is a huge strength.
It is. But if a massive multi-day forest fire breaks out right in the middle of the harvest season, pulling all those volunteers away from their jobs is going to economically devastate that town.
Oh, I see what you mean.
Right. If you're an ambitious king, you want full-time killers who don't have to worry about bringing in the wheat crop.
Well, what's fascinating here is that the economic risk you're pointing out is exactly why warfare was strictly seasonal.
They planned around the harvest.
Precisely. Rulers almost exclusively launched campaigns during the dry season after the harvest was collected and before the next planting began.
So it was a precise, localized calculus.
Exactly. The real catalyst that would eventually shatter this seasonal cycle wasn't some internal shift in philosophy.
It was outside influence.
Right. It was the sudden, violent introduction of imported military technology. When a society suddenly acquired horses or advanced weaponry and the environment allowed them to utilize it,
They had to adapt.
the part-time militias either adapted immediately or they were conquered.
That transition from a seasonal militia to a permanent military-industrial complex is so fascinating. Like, how does an entire society restructure its economy to support a permanent army?
It takes a massive shock to the system.
And to see that mechanism in action, we have to travel back to ancient Egypt, long before Thutmose III, and his march on Megiddo.
To a catastrophic event that forced the Egyptians to adapt or die.
Yeah, we are looking at the end of the Middle Kingdom, roughly 1650 BCE.
For centuries, Egypt had been this relatively isolated, secure superpower.
Because of their geography.
Right. The desert protected their flanks, and the Nile provided immense agricultural wealth. Because of this security, their military was essentially what we just described.
Local militias.
Yeah, a conscription system that called up a small fraction of men for temporary labor or defense and a very small royal guard.
And their weaponry was, frankly, kind of rudimentary compared to what was coming.
Very basic.
They were fighting with simple bows made from a single piece of wood, stone-headed maces, blades made of soft copper, and shields that were basically animal hide stretched over wooden frames.
Which was effective enough against local raiders.
Right, but it was not designed for high-intensity peer-to-peer warfare.
And then the Hyksos arrived.
The Hyksos. Who were they exactly?
They were a mix of Semitic peoples from Western Asia who crossed the Sinai Peninsula and basically invaded the fertile Nile Delta.
And they brought with them a suite of military technology that was basically alien to the Egyptians.
Oh, it must have felt like an alien invasion. The psychological shock alone would have been completely paralyzing.
What was the defining piece of tech?
The defining technology the Hyksos brought was the horse-drawn chariot.
Wow.
Yeah. Before this moment, horses were incredibly rare in Egypt. They were kept mostly as exotic pets by the extreme elite. They were never used in war.
So seeing them pulling a war machine must have been terrifying.
Completely. The chariot was a mobile firing platform, and the firepower it carried was the composite bow.
Okay, we need to pause and explain the mechanics of the composite bow.
We really do, because it is a masterpiece of ancient engineering.
An Egyptian simple bow was just a curved piece of wood, right?
Right. It had a very limited draw weight and range. A composite bow, on the other hand, is built by laminating different materials together.
So it's layers.
Exactly. Typically a wooden core, animal horn on the belly, that's the side facing the archer, and animal sinew on the back, the side facing the target.
It's all about physics.
Pure physics.
Because the wood gives it shape. But when you draw the string back, the horn on the inside of the curve naturally resists compression.
Right.
And the sinew on the outside resists tension. So it stores a terrifying amount of kinetic energy.
And when you release it, it snaps back with incredible violence. A composite bow could fire an arrow a full 200 meters further than the Egyptian simple bows.
That's insane. Combine that range with mobility.
Exactly. A Hyksos archer in a chariot could ride just outside the maximum range of the Egyptian infantry, rain down high-velocity arrows, and ride away before the Egyptians could close the distance.
And it wasn't just the bow, right?
No, the Hyksos also had bronze armor, socketed narrow-bladed axes designed specifically to pierce armor, and curved sickle swords called kopeshes.
Which could hook around an opponent's shield. Let's do
Blah.
the tactical math here. You have soft copper blades and cowhide shields up against bronze armor, armor-piercing axes, and mobile snipers shooting armor-piercing arrows from 200 meters away.
It was a slaughter. The Egyptians were practically naked on the battlefield.
And that technological disparity led to the Hyksos conquering Lower Egypt.
And ruling it for over a century.
100 years.
Yeah. It took the Egyptians roughly 100 years to push the Hyksos back out, and then another 50 years of intense societal restructuring to fully master and manufacture this new technology themselves.
But this trauma, this brutal realization that the deserts would no longer protect them, that's what birthed the New Kingdom Standing Army.
Exactly. They couldn't rely on the seasonal militia anymore.
And the Egyptians didn't just copy the Hyksos chariot. They reverse-engineered it and optimized it for their specific strategic needs, didn't they?
They completely revamped it. The original Hyksos chariots were heavy, they often had 8-spoke wheels, and the axle was mounted in the center of the cab.
So they were basically slow, heavy, mobile platforms meant to transport heavily armored warriors to the front line.
Right. But the Egyptians turned it into a high-speed pursuit vehicle.
The engineering refinements are just brilliant.
They really are. The Egyptians moved the axle from the center to the extreme rear of the cab.
What did that do?
Well, this shifted the weight distribution, putting some of the burden onto the horses via the yoke pole, but drastically increasing the stability of the cab.
So it wouldn't flip over.
Exactly. It allowed the chariot to take sharp turns at high speed without flipping. They also reduced the wheels to a lighter 6-spoke design.
My favorite detail is the shock absorption.
Yes, because they didn't have springs.
Right? They developed this complex, flexible U-shaped joint made of soaked leather and wood to connect the yoke pole to the chariot cab.
It's ingenious.
It allowed the cab to flex independently of the pole, absorbing the impact of rocky terrain so the archer could actually maintain his aim while moving at a full gallop.
And the final Egyptian chariot was so light, it weighed only about 34 kilograms.
Seriously, just 34 kilos.
Yeah. It was so light that 2 men could easily pick it up and carry it over rough terrain if necessary.
Wow. But building the weapon is only half the battle.
Right. Maintaining a permanent force to actually use it is where the society fundamentally shifts.
The new kingdom militarized on a massive scale.
Massive. They began conscripting roughly 1 in every 10 men into permanent service.
1 in 10.
Yeah, and to manage this, they created a dedicated professional officer corps. These officers were given significant land grants by the pharaoh.
Which created a permanent, wealthy military aristocracy.
Exactly, an aristocracy whose fortunes were directly tied to the success of the army.
Let's talk about the logistics of keeping this war machine running, because the math here is staggering.
It really is.
Stapleton points out that a single Egyptian division would have about 500 chariots.
Which means 1,000 horses right off the bat.
Plus all the baggage train animals. And a horse working in the desert requires immense fuel. A division needed up to 6,800 kilograms of grain.
Wow.
And over 15,000 liters of water every single day.
You absolutely cannot forage that kind of volume in the Sinai Desert or the arid Levant.
So how did they do it?
It requires a massive centralized state apparatus. The new kingdom built fortified supply depots along their marching route.
Like ancient gas stations.
Basically, yeah. They organized massive donkey caravans moving constantly back and forth from the Nile, bringing grain and water in sealed clay jars.
This really is the birth of the military-industrial complex in Africa. I mean, a state where a huge percentage of its GDP is dedicated solely to projecting violence outward.
Which brings us right back to Thutmose III at the Battle of Megiddo in the 1400s BCE.
Right where we started. He has this incredibly fast, highly drilled, logistically supported war machine.
And he uses it to take that narrow mountain pass, surprise the rebel coalition, and rout them completely.
And he actually captured hundreds of enemy chariots because they were too heavy to pull away in time, right?
Exactly. Thutmose III really represents the peak of this new offensive doctrine. I mean, he conducted 17 separate campaigns into the Levant and Syria.
17. That's relentless.
And what highlights his strategic genius is how he solved the logistical nightmare of the desert march we were just talking about.
Right, because marching an army across the Sinai was exhausting, even with all those supply depots.
So Thutmose developed the first recorded amphibious military operations.
That is just incredible for the 1400s BCE.
He built a navy, loaded his chariot divisions onto ships, sailed up the Mediterranean coast, and landed his army directly into modern-day Lebanon.
Completely bypassing the desert.
Really?
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. It presents a massive historical irony.
Have a sip.
Well, the Hyksos introduced the chariot to Egypt to conquer them, but by doing so, didn't they essentially hand Egypt the exact blueprint for their own destruction?
Oh, without a doubt. Egypt used the chariot to forge an empire that stretched from Syria all the way to the borders of modern Sudan.
But this reliance on a single, highly specialized technology also created a vulnerability, didn't it?
It always does, and we see this centuries later with Pharaoh Ramses II at the Battle of Kadesh in 1274 BCE.
Against the Hittite Empire.
Right. Kadesh is a perfect case study in the fragility of a highly tuned military machine.
Set the scene for us.
So Ramses II was marching his army into Syria to capture the city of Kadesh. The Hittites, who had their own massive chariot forces, used incredible counterintelligence.
Spies.
Yes. They sent spies posing as deserters into the Egyptian camp, and these spies told Ramesses that the Hittite army was hundreds of miles away in Aleppo.
And Ramesses just buys it.
He buys it completely. He drops his guards, strings his 4 divisions out along the marching route, and sets up camp near the city with only a fraction of his force.
Oh, no.
But the entire Hittite army is actually hiding right behind the city.
So they spring the trap.
The Hittites launch a massive surprise attack. Thousands of heavy Hittite chariots crash into the completely unprepared Egyptian marching column.
There's a big chaos.
Total chaos. The Egyptian division is shattered, and the survivors flee toward Ramses' camp, basically bringing the Hittite chariots right to the pharaoh's doorstep.
Ramses is completely surrounded.
He is, and he survives basically through sheer personal bravery.
And his lighter chariots helped, right?
Yeah, the incredible mobility of his lighter chariots allowed him to dart around the heavier Hittite formations.
And he got pretty lucky, too.
Very lucky. There was this incredibly timed arrival of an allied mercenary force that hits the Hittites in the rear.
Wow. So how did it end?
It was essentially a tactical draw, but it was a strategic defeat for Egypt. It proves that no matter how good your technology is, if your intelligence fails, a standing army can be wiped out in hours.
That is exactly the lesson.
Yeah.
But while Egypt was dominating the Mediterranean coast with chariots, a completely different military superpower was rising to the south, right?
Right. If we follow the Nile down into modern-day Sudan, we encounter the Nubian kingdoms.
Most notably Kush and its later capital, Meroe.
Exactly. The Nubians are a fascinating counterbalance to Egypt. They fought constantly over control of the trade routes moving gold and ivory north.
But Nubia had a massive geographical problem when it came to warfare.
They didn't have access to the tin deposits required to smelt bronze.
So while Egypt is running around in bronze armor, Nubia had to find another way.
And their solution was brilliant. They essentially bypassed the Bronze Age entirely and became early masters of iron metallurgy.
Because iron ore was plentiful in their region.
Exactly. Now, the smelting process for iron is much harder. It requires significantly higher temperatures and much more complex carbonization techniques than bronze.
But the payoff is huge.
Huge. The resulting metal is harder and holds a much sharper edge. The Kingdom of Meroe became this massive iron-producing hub.
And they used that iron to optimize a completely different military doctrine.
Right. While Egypt focused on chariots and massed infantry blocks with spears, the Nubians became the undisputed masters of archery.
It wasn't just a support weapon for them.
Not at all. Archery was the core of their military identity.
They utilized these deeply penetrating iron-tipped arrows.
And their skill was legendary in the ancient world. Let's fast forward to the 7th century CE.
Oh.
The rapidly expanding Arab Islamic armies attempted to invade Nubia from Egypt. Now, the Arab armies were highly mobile, accustomed to sweeping away Byzantine forces.
They were basically unstoppable at that point.
But when they met the Nubians, they were devastated by the sheer accuracy of the Nubian archers.
The historical accounts from the Arab writers are terrifying.
Oh, they are. They called the Nubians the pupil smiters.
Because the archers were specifically aiming for and hitting the eyes of the Arab cavalrymen.
Can you imagine the psychological toll of having your front ranks systematically blinded by iron arrows from a distance? It was too much.
It broke the Arab advance.
Completely. The invasion was so disastrous that the Arab commanders were forced to negotiate a non-aggression pact with the Nubians.
Which was known as the Back.
Yes, the Pact. This treaty established trade relations and a mutual promise not to invade.
And incredibly, the Bat held for nearly 700 years.
700 years of peace. It is a stunning example of how mastering a specific local technology, in this case, iron archery, can halt a seemingly unstoppable expansionist force.
The Nubians also utilized another strategic asset that terrified the Mediterranean world.
War elephants.
War elephants. The Kingdom of Meroe actively captured and trained African elephants for combat.
They basically used them as ancient tanks to break infantry formations.
We even have archaeological evidence of their reach, which I find hilarious.
The Augustus head.
Yes. There's a beautifully preserved bronze head of the Roman Emperor Augustus that was found buried under the steps of a temple in Meroe.
Right. It was looted by a Nubian army during a raid on Roman Egypt around 25 BCE.
And they buried it, specifically so that the Nubians would symbolically step on the Roman Emperor's face every single time they entered the temple.
It's such a powerful, defiant statement of sovereignty.
It really is. But if we want to talk about war elephants, we have to look west, across the top of Africa.
To the coast of modern-day Tunisia.
Exactly, to the maritime empire of Carthage. The Carthage offers a masterclass in a completely different method of military organization.
The mercenary state.
Right. Carthage was originally founded by Phoenician colonists from the Eastern Mediterranean. They were a civilization of merchants and sailors.
They built a massive commercial empire that controlled the shipping lanes of the Western Mediterranean.
They had an incredible navy, obviously.
Yeah.
But their land army was fundamentally different from Egypt's conscript system or Nubia's archers.
Yeah, Carthage essentially bought its army.
Because the Carthaginian citizens were primarily focused on naval operations and, lucrative maritime trade.
Right, so they used their massive wealth to just hire foreign mercenaries to fight their land wars for them.
They hired heavy infantry from Gaul and Spain.
Slingers from the Balearic Islands, who, by the way, could throw lead bullets with the stopping power of a modern handgun.
That's terrifying. And most importantly, they hired the Numidian cavalry.
We really need to explain the Numidian cavalry because they are often cited as the finest horsemen of antiquity.
Really?
The Numidians were indigenous Berber peoples from North Africa, and they rode their horses without a saddle and without a bridle.
Wait, really? No bridle?
None. They controlled the horse entirely with a simple neck strap and just leg pressure. It gave them unbelievable agility.
And how do they fight?
They fought as light skirmishers. They wore no armor, carrying only a small shield and a bundle of light javelins.
So they relied on speed.
Total speed. Their tactic was to ride at a dead sprint toward an enemy formation, hurl their javelins into the ranks, and wheel away before the heavy infantry could even raise their weapons.
So they were meant to harass, exhaust, and pull enemy formations out of alignment. I look at the Carthaginian army, and it's like a heavily outsourced modern corporation.
That's a great analogy.
You have this core executive board of Carthaginian generals, and they are managing independent contractors from half a dozen different nations.
All speaking different languages, all using different weapons.
It gives you incredible flexibility and access to top-tier specialists, but the risk profile is astronomical.
Oh, absolutely. If the treasury runs dry or a supply ship sinks, those mercenaries will mutiny immediately.
Because there's no underlying patriotism holding the army together.
Exactly. But when properly funded and led by a genius, it was devastating.
And Carthage produced one of the greatest military minds in history.
Hannibal Barca.
Hannibal took this polyglot mercenary army and just unleashed it on the Roman Republic during the Second Punic War.
And his masterpiece is the Battle of Cannae in 216 BCE.
This battle is still taught in military academies globally.
Because it is the perfect execution of a double envelopment.
Let's break Cannae down. Rome fielded a massive army, right?
Huge. Roughly 86,000 men, heavily weighted with their famous heavy infantry legions.
And Hannibal had, what, about 50,000?
About 50,000 men. The Romans deployed in a massive, deep block, intending to use their sheer weight to just punch straight through the center of Hannibal's line.
But Hannibal anticipates this perfectly.
He really does. He places his most unreliable, lightly armed mercenaries in the very center of his line, bowing outward toward the Romans.
Like a convex shake.
Right. And on the edges of his infantry line, he places his elite, heavy African infantry.
In the flanks.
On the far flanks, he puts his cavalry, including those Numidians we just talked about.
So when the battle begins, the Roman legions smash into the center of Hannibal's line.
And exactly as Hannibal planned, the center slowly collapses and retreats backward under the pressure.
The Romans, thinking they're winning, push forward aggressively.
Right, but they start losing their formation as they try to pursue.
The retreating Carthaginian center turns the shape of the battle from a straight line into a U shape.
The Romans have essentially pushed themselves deep into a pocket.
And then Hannibal springs the trap.
His elite heavy infantry on the edges wheel inward, hitting the Romans on both sides.
Simultaneously, his cavalry, having chased the Roman cavalry off the field, swings around and closes the back of the pocket.
It is a complete encirclement. The Roman legions are packed so tightly together that the men in the center literally cannot raise their arms to draw their swords.
That is horrifying.
It becomes a methodical day-long slaughter. By sunset, somewhere between 50 and 70,000 Romans are dead.
50 to 70,000 in one day.
One of the highest single-day death tolls in military history, and it was executed by a contracted army.
But the inherent flaw in that outsourcing model eventually caught up with Carthage.
It did. Because Rome was a society entirely mobilized for war.
They absorbed the horrific losses of Cannae and just kept fighting. They studied Hannibal's tactics and they adapted.
Which leads us to the Battle of Zama in 22 BCE, where the Roman general Scipio Africanus finally neutralizes the Carthaginian war machine.
How did Scipio do it?
Well, Scipio understood the mechanics of the Carthaginian army. First, he managed to flip the Numidian cavalry.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, through diplomacy and bribery, he convinced key Numidian leaders to abandon Carthage and actually fight for Rome.
So suddenly, Hannibal's eyes and ears, his screening force, is just gone.
Exactly. And Scipio also solves the problem of Carthage's war elephants.
Right, because previously, a charge of heavily armored elephants would shatter a tightly packed Roman infantry line.
But at Zama, Scipio deploys his legions differently. Instead of a solid wall of men, he leaves wide vertical lanes between the units.
And he hides the gaps with a few light skirmishers in front.
Yes. When Hannibal orders the elephant charge, Scipio's skirmishers blow loud horns, terrifying the animals.
The elephants charge toward the Roman lines, but instead of hitting a solid wall, they naturally take the path of least resistance.
Straight down the empty lanes Scipio had deliberately left open.
The Romans simply step aside, hurl javelins into the elephants' flanks as they pass through, and then slaughter them in the rear.
The elephants hit basically nothing. Then Scipio's cavalry returns to hit Hannibal from behind, and Carthage is defeated.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, the Roman victory at Zama and the eventual total destruction of the city of Carthage in 146 BCE fundamentally altered the geography of power.
The Mediterranean essentially became a Roman lake. North Africa became the breadbasket of the Roman Empire, heavily fortified and governed from Italy.
And Rome's dominance lasted for centuries. Even after the western half of the Roman Empire collapsed, bringing the Vandal invasions to North Africa, the Byzantine Empire, the eastern half of Rome, managed to reconquer the coastline.
But the rigid, static defense of the Byzantines was utterly unprepared for the entirely new military paradigm that erupted from the Arabian Peninsula.
In the 7th century CE, the Arab conquests.
Right. In a remarkably short period following the death of the Prophet Muhammad in 632 CE, Arab armies basically exploded outward,
Conquering the Middle East and sweeping across the entirety of North Africa.
all the way to the Atlantic coast of Morocco.
How did they do it so fast?
The Arab armies possessed a terrifying strategic mobility. They were utilizing the camel for deep desert logistics.
Which allowed them to bypass traditional defensive choke points.
Exactly. And they relied heavily on fast, unarmored horse cavalry for combat. Meanwhile, the Byzantine forces in North Africa were largely heavy infantry and heavy cavalry stationed in massive stone fortresses.
It's like a clash of two entirely different doctrines.
And it is perfectly illustrated by the Arab conquest of Egypt. In 640 CE, an Arab commander named Amr ibn al-As marched a relatively small force into Egypt.
And the Byzantine governor, Theodore, had a massive, well-equipped army garrisoned at the fortress of Babylon, right near modern Cairo.
Theodore marches his huge army out to the plains of Heliopolis to crush what he assumes is just a minor raiding force.
But Theodore's fatal flaw was arrogance, right?
Arrogance and a complete reliance on static military doctrine. He marches his army out in a massive, slow-moving block. He doesn't even bother to send out light cavalry scouts to probe the terrain ahead of him.
And Amr ibn al-As uses that arrogance against him.
Exactly. The night before the battle, Amr takes detachments of his cavalry and hides them behind the hills and in dry riverbeds on the flanks of the battlefield.
So they're just waiting.
The next morning, Theodore marches forward, fixes his attention entirely on the small Arab force directly in front of him, and engages.
And the moment the Byzantine infantry commits.
The hidden Arab cavalry explodes from the hill. They hit the Byzantines in the flanks and the rear simultaneously.
The Byzantine formation just shatters instantly in the panic.
It's a total rout, and the Arab victory breaks Byzantine control over the Nile Valley.
But military history isn't just about battles, right? It's about politics and economics.
Always. The Arab conquests of North Africa were incredibly fast, not just because of cavalry tactics, but because of massive local discontent.
Because the Byzantines were terrible rulers.
Oh, the local populations, like the Coptic Christians in Egypt or the Berbers in the Maghreb, they were being taxed into poverty by the Byzantines and persecuted for their religious beliefs.
So when the Arab armies arrived, they offered a very pragmatic deal.
Right. If a city surrendered without a fight, the locals were guaranteed freedom of religion, and they were subjected to a tax called the jizya.
And crucially, paying the jizya exempted you from military service.
Yes. And the tax rate was often significantly lower than what the Byzantines had been extorting. Consequently, many North African cities simply opened their gates to the Arabs.
Over the following centuries, North Africa saw a succession of powerful Islamic dynasties. You had the Fatimids, who founded Cairo.
And the Ayyubid dynasty, most famously led by Saladin, who recaptured Jerusalem from the Crusaders.
Right. The military structures of these empires relied heavily on vast networks of fortifications and massive cavalry armies. But the Ayyubids introduced a military system that would eventually overthrow them, didn't they?
Yes, the Mamluks.
The Mamluks. This system is wild.
The Mamluk system is one of the most paradoxical and fascinating military structures in human history. The word Mamluk essentially translates to one who is owned.
So they were enslaved.
Yes. The system involved purchasing enslaved young boys, primarily from the Turkic tribes of the Eurasian steppe and the Caucasus Mountains.
These boys were brought to Egypt, officially converted to Islam, and then placed into these intensely rigorous military academies.
They were taught to read and write, but their primary education was intensely martial. They were trained exhaustively in equitation, swordsmanship, and most importantly, archery from horseback.
And here's the paradox. They were legally enslaved to the Sultan or high-ranking generals.
But upon graduating from their training, they were formally emancipated and became the absolute military elite of the society.
It's such a strange concept.
Well, the logic was that because they were brought in as outsiders, separated from their families and local Egyptian politics, their only loyalty was supposed to be to their owners and their fellow Mamluk classmates.
But when you create an entire caste of elite, highly trained killers, and give them a monopoly on military force.
You have created a ticking time bomb?
Yeah. In 1250, the Mamelukes did exactly what you would expect.
Yeah.
They overthrew their Ayyubid masters, murdered the Sultan, and took total control of Egypt.
They established a sultanate where the ruling class was entirely composed of former slaves. A Mamluk's status was determined not by his birth, but by his martial prowess and his political maneuvering.
And militarily, they were phenomenal, weren't they?
Unbelievable. They were the force that finally expelled the last of the Crusaders from the Levant, and astonishingly, they were the army that halted the seemingly invincible Mongol invasion at the Battle of Ain Jalut in 1260.
So for over 2 centuries, the Mamluks were arguably the finest heavy cavalry in the world.
They fought with a composite bow, a lance, and a curved saber, all from the saddle.
But their entire identity, their justification for ruling Egypt, was tied to this very specific, deeply traditional form of aristocratic cavalry warfare.
And that cultural rigidity would absolutely be their doom.
Which brings us to the early 16th century and the rise of the Ottoman Empire, based in modern Turkey.
The Ottomans were rapidly expanding, and they had embraced a terrifying new technology: gunpowder.
The Ottomans were fielding large units of infantry called janissaries, right?
Yes, who were armed with early muskets called matchlocks. They also utilized massive siege cannons and lighter, wagon-mounted field artillery.
So in 1516, the Ottoman army marched south to confront the Mamluk Empire at the Battle of Marj-Dabik in Syria.
And the clash wasn't just two armies, it was two entirely different eras of warfare colliding.
The Mamluks showed up to the battlefield in their magnificent armor, riding purebred Arabian horses.
They possessed a few rudimentary cannons, but the Mamluk elite viewed firearms with utter contempt.
They just refused to use them.
They considered shooting an enemy from a distance with a noisy, smoky tube to be a cowardly, dishonorable way to fight, completely beneath the dignity of a true horseman.
I just want to pause here. Why did the Mamluks, who were professional soldiers, fail to adapt to gunpowder when the ancient Egyptians adapted to the chariot so effectively? Is there a point where an elite military caste becomes too proud to innovate?
That is exactly what happened. The psychological block is astounding. You have professional soldiers who are actively choosing to ignore the most lethal weapon on the battlefield because it doesn't fit their aesthetic of war.
So at Marj-Dabik, and again the following year at the Battle of Rodinia near Cairo, the Mamluks attempted their traditional, glorious cavalry charges.
And the Ottomans simply chained their artillery wagons together to form a barricade.
Like a wall of wagons.
Right, and behind the wagons, the Janissary infantry leveled their matchlocks. The charging Mamluk cavalry was torn to pieces by cannon fire and massed musket volleys before they could even get within striking distance.
And the noise and smoke must have terrified the Mamluk horses.
It broke their formations completely. The Mamluk Empire was shattered almost overnight. Egypt was absorbed into the Ottoman Empire
because they refused to adapt to gunpowder.
The refusal to change their cultural definition of warfare cost them everything. And the Ottoman victory didn't just stop at Egypt. It fundamentally reorganized the entirety of North Africa.
Following the conquest of Egypt, Ottoman influence pushed westward along the Mediterranean coast, establishing provinces in what is now Libya, Tunisia, and Algeria.
They seized control of major ports like Tripoli, Tunis, and Algiers. But these provinces quickly developed a very specific, highly aggressive military economy.
We have to look at the global economic map of the 16th century here.
Right. The Portuguese had just rounded the southern tip of Africa and opened a direct naval route to the Indian Ocean spice trade, essentially bypassing the traditional overland routes through the Middle East.
Simultaneously, the Christian powers of Europe were actively blockading Muslim shipping in the Mediterranean.
Cut off from traditional trade revenues, these North African Ottoman provinces, often referred to by Europeans as the Barbary states, turned to state-sponsored naval warfare.
We colloquially call it piracy, but that conjures images of chaotic rogues burying treasure.
It wasn't that at all. This was a highly organized, institutionalized extortion racket managed by the state.
So what does this all mean? Let's break down the extortion racket. I think the best modern parallel is ransomware, but executed with heavily armed sailing ships.
That's a very accurate comparison. The rulers of these cities, like the days of Algiers or the Karamanli dynasty in Libya, they authorized fleets of fast, maneuverable corsair ships to attack European merchant vessels.
And they weren't just stealing cargo.
No, the primary commodity was human beings. They captured European sailors and passengers, brought them back to North Africa, and held them for enormous ransoms.
The political economy of the state relied on this influx of cash. The rulers used the ransom money and the direct tribute paid by European nations to avoid being attacked to fund their militaries.
And their militaries were essentially occupying forces. The rulers imported thousands of Turkish Janissary soldiers from the heart of the Ottoman Empire.
These Janissaries garrisoned the coastal cities, manned the massive defensive cannons pointing out to sea,
and periodically marched inland to brutally extort taxes from the local North African populations. The piracy funded the Janissaries, and the Janissaries kept the local rulers in power.
It was a highly lucrative, brutal business model that exploited the fragmented nature of European politics.
The European powers were constantly at war with each other, so it was actually cheaper for a nation like Britain or France to simply pay the tribute to the Barbary states rather than divert their navies to fight them.
But that vulnerability shifted dramatically at the turn of the 19th century. After the American Revolution, the newly formed United States no longer had the protection of the British Navy.
So American merchant ships were suddenly prime targets. At first, the U.S. government paid the exorbitant tributes, which at one point accounted for roughly 20% of the entire U.S. federal budget.
20%. But eventually, the extortion became too much, sparking the First Barbary War in 1801.
This conflict highlights how globalized military operations had become. In 1805, the U.S. government actually backed a coup attempt in Libya.
A small detachment of U.S. Marines, alongside a large force of Arab and Greek mercenaries, marched over 500 miles across the Libyan desert from Egypt.
To launch a surprise attack on the port city of Darna. It's an insane logistical feat, and it's exactly why the U.S. Marine Corps hymn references the shores of Tripoli.
The Marines captured the city, and in recognition of the victory, the local Allied commander presented the Marine officer with a curved Mamluk-style saber.
Yes. To this day, the ceremonial sword carried by U.S. Marine officers is a replica of that Mamluk blade.
It's amazing how that history lingers. But the Barbary model finally collapsed entirely in the 1830s.
Once the Napoleonic Wars ended, the European powers no longer tolerated the piracy. In 1830, the French used a minor diplomatic insult as an excuse to launch a massive, full-scale invasion of Algeria.
The French showed up with an overwhelming modern fleet and a massive infantry force. They captured Algiers, dismantled the Janissary garrisons, and began a brutal colonial occupation.
But the inland populations, who had hated the Ottoman rulers anyway, immediately began a fierce resistance, most notably led by a brilliant military and religious leader named Abd al-Qadir.
Abd al-Qadir fought a brilliant guerrilla war against the French for over 15 years, utilizing the mountainous terrain and mobile cavalry to constantly ambush French columns.
And the difficulty of fighting this counterinsurgency forced the French military to adapt their own forces, leading to the creation of famous colonial units.
This is where we get the Zouaves and the Spahis.
Exactly. The French realized their standard heavy infantry marching in tight blocks were just getting slaughtered in the Algerian mountains, so they recruited local Berber fighters, the Zouawa,
and eventually adopted their tactics and uniforms for French soldiers. The Zouaves wore distinctive baggy trousers, short open jackets, and fezzes.
They fought as light infantry, utilizing open-order skirmishing, moving quickly over rough terrain, and firing from cover.
They were so terrifyingly effective that the Zouaves' style of uniform and drill was copied by armies all over the world, even by volunteer regiments during the American Civil War.
Similarly, the French created the Spahis, locally recruited light cavalry units, wearing distinctive red cloaks to match the mobility of Abd al-Qadir's horsemen.
While the French were slowly grinding down the resistance in the Maghreb, something entirely different and arguably much more terrifying was happening to the east in Egypt.
Yes. Following a brief, shocking invasion of Egypt by Napoleon Bonaparte in 1798, where French artillery easily butchered the remnants of the old Mamluk cavalry, an Ottoman Albanian commander named Muhammad Ali seized power in Cairo.
Muhammad Ali is a pivotal figure. He witnessed firsthand the absolute superiority of modern, drilled European infantry and artillery.
He recognized that the old Ottoman model of relying on irregular mercenaries and aristocratic Mamluk cavalry was totally dead. He decided to build a massive, modern, European-style military machine in Egypt.
And his first step was securing his political flank. In 1811, he invited the remaining Mamluk leadership to a grand feast at the Citadel in Cairo.
It was a trap.
A brutal one. Once they were inside the narrow stone corridors of the fortress, he ordered his Albanian musketeers to open fire from the walls,
He massacred the entire Mamluk elite in one afternoon.
permanently destroying the military caste that had ruled Egypt for centuries. With internal opposition removed, Muhammad Ali needed massive manpower for his new army.
Initially, he attempted to fund his modernization through sheer, brutal conquest. He invaded Sudan to the south with a specific, horrifying objective to capture tens of thousands of black Africans to enslave and convert into a massive slave army.
Mirroring the original creation of the Mamluks, but armed with muskets.
Right, but it was a logistical catastrophe. He captured the people, but marching them thousands of miles north through the harsh Sudanese and Egyptian deserts exposed them to horrific conditions.
The captives died by the thousands from exhaustion and unfamiliar diseases before they even reached the training camps in Egypt.
The slave-soldier pipeline failed completely. Faced with this failure, Muhammad Ali resorted to a measure that was unprecedented and deeply shocking to Egyptian society.
In 1822, he instituted mass conscription of the Egyptian peasantry, the fellahin.
For centuries, the peasants had been the agricultural engine of Egypt, but had been strictly barred from military service, which was the domain of foreign elites.
And this conscription was enforced with absolute brutality. Men were dragged from their villages in chains.
The peasants hated it so much, and the conditions in the army were so lethal that a wave of horrific self-mutilations swept the countryside.
This part is so grim. Men would intentionally chop off their right index finger so they couldn't pull a musket trigger.
Or they would blind themselves in their right eye with rat poison so they couldn't aim down a barrel just to avoid the draft.
But Muhammad Ali didn't care. He simply formed specific regiments composed entirely of one-eyed men or men missing fingers, forcing them to learn how to shoot left-handed.
Through sheer terror and the hiring of European military advisors, including dozens of veteran French officers who had served under Napoleon, he forged an incredibly disciplined modern army of over 100,000 men.
And he unleashed this army on the region. His Egyptian forces, armed with modern muskets and artillery, marched back into Sudan and completely annihilated the traditional sword and shield armies of states like Darfur.
He invaded the Arabian Peninsula and crushed a rebellion there. He even invaded Syria, marching against his own nominal overlord, the Ottoman Sultan, and repeatedly defeated the Ottoman armies.
But Muhammad Ali's ambition eventually triggered the fatal trap of imported military modernization.
Right. He had built a massive army and a modern fleet, but he didn't have the deep industrial base to sustain it against a peer opponent.
During the Greek War of Independence in the 1820s, the Ottoman Sultan begged Muhammad Ali for help. Ali sent his modernized Egyptian navy to crush the Greek rebellion.
But the major European powers, Britain, France, and Russia, intervened to protect Greece. In 1827, at the Battle of Navarino, the combined European fleets trapped the Egyptian Ottoman navy in a bay.
The European ships had heavier cannons, better gunnery drill, and more robust construction. In a matter of hours, the Egyptian navy was completely obliterated.
Navarino is a stark demonstration of dependency. You can import European ships, and you can hire French officers to drill your men, but if you lack the domestic foundries to cast your own massive cannons and the shipyards to build your own dreadnoughts, you are entirely at the mercy of the nations that do.
What stands out to you about this? Think about the surreal historical intersections this reliance on global military markets created.
Oh, it gets incredibly bizarre.
Because Egypt became this hub of military modernization, it drew in bizarre global elements. In the 1860s, the French Emperor Napoleon III asked Egypt for troops to help secure his disastrous imperial adventure in Mexico.
And Egypt actually sent a battalion of black Sudanese troops captured during those earlier brutal raids across the Atlantic to fight in Mexico.
The horrific pseudoscientific rationale was that because these men were from Africa, the French believed they would be naturally immune to the yellow fever that was decimating French troops in the Mexican jungles.
They fought bravely in a war they had absolutely no connection to, purely as pawns of Egyptian diplomatic maneuvering.
And it gets weirder. By the 1870s, after the American Civil War, the Egyptian army hired dozens of unemployed American generals, veterans of both the Union and the Confederacy, to move to Cairo and run their military academies and map their frontiers.
You had men who fought at Gettysburg trying to figure out the logistics of moving Egyptian artillery down the Nile. It perfectly illustrates how deeply interconnected North Africa was with the Mediterranean and Atlantic worlds.
But if we shift our focus south, across the Sahara Desert, we find a massive military ecosystem that operated on an entirely different set of environmental and economic rules.
We are moving into West Africa. The Sahel, the broad savanna stretching below the desert, hosted some of the wealthiest and most powerful empires in human history: Ghana, Mali, and Songhai.
And the economic engine that built these empires was driven by three things: gold, salt, and the introduction of the camel.
Around 400 CE, the camel was introduced to the region from the Middle East. It is impossible to overstate the importance of this biological technology.
A camel can survive for days without water and carry massive loads across shifting sands. It transformed the impassable Sahara Desert into an ocean of trade.
Massive caravans began moving the abundant gold from the forests of West Africa north to the Mediterranean and bringing back vast slabs of salt, which was necessary for preserving food and retaining water in the heat.
To control that immense wealth, you needed to control the trading cities like Timbuktu and Gao. And to control the cities, you needed military power capable of projecting force across the vast, open plains of the savannah.
The early empire of ancient Ghana relied primarily on massive armies of infantry armed with bows and iron-tipped spears. But as we move into the 13th century with the rise of the Mali Empire, under its legendary founder Sunjata, we see the massive integration of heavy cavalry.
This cavalry wasn't like the light, skirmishing Numidians. These were heavy shock troops. The riders wore padded armor made of thick, quilted cotton, which was surprisingly effective at stopping arrows.
They carried long lances and broadswords, and later the Songhai Empire expanded on this, fielding armies with tens of thousands of horsemen, supported by massive fleets of large wooden canoes that could transport troops rapidly up and down the Niger River.
I want to talk about the logistics of this cavalry, though, because maintaining a cavalry force in West Africa was biologically devastating, wasn't it?
It was a nightmare. As you move slightly south from the dry Sahel into the wetter savanna and forest margins, you encounter the tsetse fly.
The tsetse fly carries a parasite that causes trypanosomiasis, or sleeping sickness.
Right, and it is highly lethal to large, imported breeds of horses. If you march your magnificent cavalry army too far south to raid for captives, your horses will be bitten, they will grow lethargic, and they will die by the thousands within weeks.
Because of this constant attrition, the West African empires couldn't successfully breed large war horses in sufficient numbers.
They had to constantly import fresh horses from North Africa, bringing them down across the Sahara trade routes, and horses were incredibly expensive.
This creates one of the most brutal economic cycles in history. To maintain the cavalry required to protect your empire, you have to buy horses from the north.
To pay for the horses, you need to export massive wealth.
Gold was one currency, but the other primary currency was human beings. The West African empires used their cavalry to raid weaker neighboring groups, capturing slaves.
Those slaves were marched north across the desert and traded to North African merchants in exchange for fresh horses, which were then used to equip the cavalry to go out and capture more slaves.
It is a self-perpetuating engine of warfare, but the combat itself was highly sophisticated.
Absolutely. Let's look at the Battle of Kyrene in 1235, the foundational battle of the Mali Empire.
Sunjata leads his forces against the Soso king, Sumaguru. The oral traditions surrounding this battle are incredibly rich and focus heavily on spiritual power.
The famous story is that Sumaguru was a powerful sorcerer who was impervious to iron weapons.
Sunjata supposedly discovers his magical weakness and has an arrow crafted tipped with the spur of a white rooster.
During the battle, Sunjata shoots Sumaguru with the magical arrow, draining his power, causing him to flee, and the Soso army to collapse. It's a fantastic narrative.
It is, but I have to question the magic at the Battle of Kyrene. While the oral tradition focuses on the magic arrow, wasn't Sunjata's true genius his tactical geometry?
Exactly. The oral tradition preserves the cultural truth of the victory. But if we analyze the accounts for tactical details, we see brilliant military geometry at play.
Sumaguru had a larger army, and he attempted a classic double envelopment, moving his forces in a massive crescent shape to crush Sunjata's flanks.
Exactly like Hannibal at Cannae. But Sunjata doesn't panic. He had his army organized in a tight defensive square.
And when he saw the Soso forces moving to flank him, he instantly ordered his troops to shift their formation.
In the middle of the chaos, his army seamlessly transitions from a square into a long, wide rectangle, stretching their line out to match and block the flanking maneuver.
Executing a complex formation change under the stress of an impending cavalry charge requires an immense level of drill, discipline, and a highly structured chain of command.
Sunjata's tactical brilliance, more than the magic arrow, is what won the day.
For centuries, empires like Mali and Songhai dominated the savannah because nobody else could field that kind of disciplined cavalry. But in 1591, the Songhai Empire was annihilated by a threat they couldn't possibly have anticipated because it violated all the known rules of geography.
The Moroccan Sultanate, looking to seize control of the West African gold trade, launched an invasion directly across the Sahara Desert.
Sending an army across the deadliest desert on Earth was considered suicidal.
But the Moroccans spent months preparing massive supply depots and specialized camel caravans. They managed to march an army of about 4,000 men thousands of miles south to the Niger River.
The Songhai Emperor, Eski II, meets the Moroccans at the Battle of Tondabi. He brings a massive force. Historians estimate tens of thousands of infantry and a huge contingent of heavy cavalry.
While the Moroccan army has been massively depleted by the Desert March, they only have about 2,000 infantrymen capable of fighting. It should have been a massacre in favor of Songhai.
But the Moroccans brought early firearms. They were armed with arquebuses.
An arquebus is a smoothbore, muzzle-loaded gun that uses a burning piece of slow-match cord to ignite the gunpowder in the pan.
It's clunky, it takes a long time to reload, and it's terribly inaccurate.
But it creates a massive flash of fire, a huge cloud of sulfurous smoke, and a deafening roar. The Moroccans also brought a few small cannons.
The Songhai commanders, seeing the Moroccans forming up, attempt to use a biological weapon to break their lines.
They herd a massive stampede of cattle toward the Moroccan infantry, hoping the cows will trample the gunmen before the cavalry charges in.
The Moroccan commander is entirely unfazed. He simply orders his men to open wide lanes in their formation.
The cattle run harmlessly through the gaps. Then the Moroccan arquebusiers close ranks and open fire on the advancing Songhai cavalry.
And the result is catastrophic. The Songhai horses, which have never heard a gunshot or smelled gunpowder, panic completely.
The massive noise and smoke cause the horses to buck, throw their riders, and turn around, trampling their own infantry in their desperation to escape.
Furthermore, the quilted armor of the cavalrymen is useless against a lead musket ball.
The Songhai army disintegrates. The Moroccans capture the major cities, and the massive, centralized Songhai empire splinters into dozens of smaller warring factions. The era of the great unified cavalry empires was over.
This power vacuum paves the way for a completely new dynamic in the 18th and 19th centuries, the Fulani jihads.
Following the collapse of Songhai, the region was dominated by smaller states, like the Hausa kingdoms in modern Nigeria.
These rulers were nominally Muslim, but they heavily taxed the peasantry, often mixed Islam with traditional local religions, and illegally enslaved fellow Muslims.
This corruption sparked a series of grassroots religious revolutions led by the Fulani people, who were primarily pastoralist cattle herders and their religious scholars.
The most significant of these was led by a charismatic cleric named Usman Dan Fodio in 1804. Dan Fodio declared a jihad, a holy war, against the Hausa kings to establish a purified Islamic state.
What is fascinating from a military perspective is how Dan Fodio's army evolved. He is fighting the Hausa states, who still rely on the old model of heavily armored aristocratic cavalry.
Dan Fodio's followers are peasants and scholars. They don't have horses, and they don't have armor.
They start as light infantry, armed with simple bows, conducting a guerrilla war from the scrublands.
The defining moment of their early survival was the Battle of Lake Kwoto in 1804.
Dan Fodio's lightly armed followers were cornered by the massive, heavy cavalry army of the Kingdom of Gobir.
Instead of scattering and running, which is exactly what heavy cavalry wants infantry to do so they could be hunted down, the Fulani fighters did something incredibly disciplined.
They formed a tightly packed defensive infantry square. They interlocked their shields and stood their ground.
When the Gobir cavalry charged, the Fulani used mass, disciplined archery.
They fired dense volleys of arrows directly into the charging horses, breaking the momentum of the charge before the lances could reach their lines.
It is the exact opposite of what you expect in this era, the peasant infantry standing firm and breaking the elite knights.
They won a stunning victory at Lake Quoto, and that victory fundamentally changed the nature of their army.
As they defeated Hausa armies, they captured their equipment, their padded armor, their swords, and crucially, their horses.
Over the next decade, Dan Fodio's army evolved from a light infantry guerrilla force into a massive, combined arms military utilizing heavy cavalry and infantry, effectively mirroring the very states they had just conquered.
They used this new military machine to conquer a vast territory, creating the Sokoto Caliphate, one of the largest empires in Africa.
A few decades later, we see a similar jihad further west, led by Umar Tal, who created the Tukular Empire.
Umar Tal recognized the power of European technology and actively armed his jihadist forces with European firearms, which he purchased from the coast using the wealth generated by his conquests.
But Umar Tal eventually pushed the limits of his technological adaptation. He attempted to expand his empire toward the Atlantic coast, putting him on a collision course with the expanding French colonial presence in Senegal.
In 1857, Umar Tal laid siege to a French fortress at Médine.
Tal brings an army of 15,000 men, many armed with muskets. But the French fort has high stone walls, modern artillery, and highly trained defenders.
The mechanics of a siege heavily favor the defender if the attacker lacks heavy cannons to breach the walls.
Umar Tal launches massive human-wave infantry assaults against the stone walls. His forces are decimated by French grape-shot cannons, firing essentially massive shotgun blasts of iron balls and concentrated musket fire.
He loses thousands of men and is forced to abandon the siege. He pivots his conquests eastward, fighting other African states, but his story ends violently.
His harsh rule sparks a massive rebellion among his own subjects, and he is eventually trapped in a cave and burned to death by rebels.
This raises an important question, though, doesn't it? In these 19th century jihads, the explicit justification for war shifted. Leaders like Dan Fodio and Umar Tal fought under the banner of religious purity and ideology.
Yet the underlying economic engine that sustained their massive armies remained exactly the same as the empires that preceded them. The capture of slaves, the extraction of tribute, and the absolute control of commercial trade routes.
The ideology changed, but the brutal logistics of maintaining power did not. And while cavalry and religious warfare were redrawing the map of the northern savannah, a terrifying technological and economic revolution was fundamentally altering the coastal forests to the south.
We are moving to the final major theater, the Atlantic coast. The arrival of Portuguese explorer ships in the 1400s began a slow, monumental shift.
For thousands of years, the economic gravity of West Africa pulled north, across the Sahara. The European ships suddenly provided a massive, lucrative market right on the coast.
But the real catalyst that exploded the region into perpetual conflict was the gun revolution, which occurred roughly between the 1650s and 1680s.
The European powers, the Portuguese, the Dutch, the British, the French, were establishing brutal sugar and tobacco plantations in the Americas. They desperately needed enslaved labor.
And the currency they used to purchase captives from African coastal states was firearms.
Specifically, the flintlock musket. We need to explain why the flintlock changed the world, because earlier guns like the arquebus or the matchlock didn't have this impact.
A matchlock requires a burning cord to ignite the powder. In the incredibly humid, often rainy environment of the West African coastal forests, keeping a cord burning is nearly impossible. A matchlock is a liability.
The flintlock changed the mechanics of ignition. It uses a piece of flint clamped into a spring-loaded hammer.
When you pull the trigger, the hammer snaps forward, the flint strikes a piece of steel, creating a shower of sparks that falls directly into a small pan of gunpowder, igniting the main charge.
It doesn't rely on a burning ember, making it vastly more weather-resistant and reliable.
It also fires significantly faster than a matchlock. But it is still a smoothbore weapon, meaning a lead ball bounces down the barrel and flies wildly upon exiting. It is horribly inaccurate, beyond 50 yards.
So, to be effective, you can't aim at individual targets. You have to line up hundreds of men shoulder to shoulder, point the guns in the general direction of the enemy, and fire massive synchronized volleys, creating a wall of flying lead.
This tactical requirement for massed volleys fundamentally changed the political structure of the region. The dense forest environment had always negated cavalry. It was an infantrymen's war fought along narrow, winding paths hacked through the jungle.
Before the flintlock, warfare was localized, fought with swords, spears, and shields to control those narrow choke points.
But once the flintlock arrives, small raiding parties are obsolete. You need thousands of men to produce effective volley fire. This requirement for massive manpower led to the rapid consolidation of power and the rise of highly centralized, heavily militarized states like the Asante Empire in modern-day Ghana.
The Asante are the prime example of adapting to this new reality. Under their early leader, Osei Tutu, in the late 17th century, they recognized the power of the gun.
They hired mercenary groups who had already acquired muskets from the coast and used them to crush their dominant rivals, the Denkira.
Once in power, the Asante built their entire state apparatus around managing the flow of guns and captives.
Because the reality of this era is a vicious, inescapable cycle. War became a mechanized process for capturing slaves.
Those slaves were marched to the coastal forts and sold to European merchants in exchange for kegs of gunpowder and crates of flintlocks. Those weapons were then immediately distributed to the army to fight more wars to capture more slaves.
It is the ultimate tragic arms race. If you are a small kingdom and you hear that your neighbor just traded captives to the Dutch for 1,000 new muskets, you have absolutely no choice.
You must immediately raid another group, capture people, and sell them to the British to buy 1,000 muskets for yourself.
Right.
If you refuse to participate in the slave trade on moral grounds, your neighbor will conquer you with their new guns, and your entire population will be sold into slavery.
Your survival, the very existence of your society, is entirely dictated by the economic demands of plantation owners sitting an ocean away in the Americas.
The Asante mastered this brutal system better than anyone else. By the 1800s, they had a highly organized bureaucracy and an army that could mobilize 80,000 men, 50,000 of whom were armed with European muskets.
They were so powerful they openly clashed with the British Empire.
And they defeated them. The Battle of Nisa-Mancal in 1824 is a classic example of how mastering the local environment can defeat a technologically superior foe.
The British governor, Sir Charles McCarthy, led a column of British regulars and local allied troops deep into the dense Asante forest to crush them.
McCarthy fundamentally misunderstood the logistics of forest warfare. The British marched into the thick jungle. The Asante, moving silently through terrain they knew perfectly, surrounded them.
When the shooting started, the local porters carrying the extra British ammunition panicked and fled into the woods.
The British soldiers fired off the rounds they had in their pouches, and then their guns were empty. The Asante closed in and absolutely annihilated the column. They killed McCarthy and took his skull back to their capital, Kumasi, as a trophy.
It was a shocking defeat for the British. But 2 years later, at the Battle of Catamanso in 1826, the strategic scenario changed.
The Asante army marched out of the dense forest and onto the open coastal plain near Accra to fight a coalition of British and local forces.
By leaving the forest, the Asante exposed themselves to European field artillery.
The British deployed a new psychological weapon, Congreve rockets. These were essentially massive, iron-cased fireworks attached to long wooden poles. You light the fuse and they shoot across the battlefield.
They are wildly inaccurate, often spinning out of control or bouncing off the ground.
But the mechanical effect is secondary to the psychological shock. The Asante had faced musket fire, but they had never experienced artillery.
A barrage of Congreve rockets produces a deafening, shrieking roar, blinding trails of sparks, and a massive explosion upon impact. The horrific noise and chaotic flight path caused total panic among the Asante ranks.
The psychological terror broke their discipline. The massive Asante army was routed by the explosions, and in the chaos they nearly lost the golden stool, the most sacred religious artifact containing the soul of the Asante nation.
It perfectly highlights how a specific weapon system like massed musketry can make you invincible in the forest, but vulnerable on the open plain against a new industrial technology.
The coastal story becomes even more complex and morally fraught when we move further west along the coast to the colonies of Sierra Leone and Liberia in the 19th century.
These settlements were established by the British and Americans, respectively, with the stated philanthropic goal of providing a home for formerly enslaved people from the Americas and individuals rescued from illegal slave ships.
But the reality on the ground was military conquest. You have groups of freed African Americans and Jamaican Maroons who were hardened veterans of brutal guerrilla wars against the British in the Caribbean mountains arriving in West Africa.
The European and American sponsors provide these settlers with modern artillery, abundant ammunition, and Western military training.
The settlers form well-drilled militias, and when disputes arise over land, trade routes, or local politics with the indigenous African populations groups like the Temne in Sierra Leone or the Dei in Liberia, The settlers used their military superiority to brutally crush them.
They bomb indigenous villages with artillery and force them into submission.
It is an incredibly dark, complex chapter of history. You have formerly enslaved people utilizing the tools and tactics of Western imperialism to colonize indigenous populations.
It fundamentally proves that military technology, organization, and economic imperatives completely override any notions of shared racial or geographical origins. The logic of power dictates the outcome.
We have covered an immense amount of historical ground today, stretching across 4 millennia. If there is a unifying theme to pull from Stapleton's work, it is that pre-colonial African military history is absolutely not a static monolith.
It is a highly complex, fiercely pragmatic tapestry of continuous adaptation.
Whether we are looking at the Egyptians reverse engineering the Hyksos chariot to build a Mediterranean empire, or the Nubians utilizing iron-tipped archery to halt the Arab expansion.
Or the West African states managing the brutal biological logistics of importing horses across the Sahara.
Or the coastal kingdoms restructuring their entire societies around the flintlock musket to survive the Atlantic slave trade. These societies were constantly analyzing the mechanics of warfare and evolving to meet existential threats.
Technology dictates the realm of the possible. At set-sea fly limits where a heavy cavalry charge can occur. The weather resistance of a flintlock dictates how densely you must pack your infantry. The tools of violence shape the political structure of the state itself.
And that is a reality that applies directly to us today. I mean, think about it. The mechanisms have changed, but the rule remains. Our modern tools, the global internet, autonomous drones, artificial intelligence, they dictate our current political and economic realities.
Technology doesn't just provide new ways to fight, it fundamentally alters why we fight and who possesses the leverage to do so.
Which leads me to a final thought, something for you to mull over regarding the long-term mechanics of power. Throughout this deep dive, we saw imported technology define the winners and the losers.
The chariots, the matchlocks, the muskets, but we also saw a recurring, fatal tragedy. Carthage relied on foreign mercenaries. Muhammad Ali imported French veterans and European ship designs. The Asante depended entirely on British and Dutch flintlocks.
And the moment that external supply chain was severed, the moment the European powers stopped selling the guns or blockaded the ports, those magnificent empires were rendered utterly defenseless.
Precisely the point. They mastered the use of the technology, but they failed to master its creation. If a society cannot independently manufacture the tools required for its own defense, if its survival relies entirely on the profit motives or the political goodwill of foreign industrial powers, is that society ever truly sovereign?
That is a chilling question to leave on, especially when you look at the complexities of modern global supply chains. It brings us right back to the beginning. History is not a neat progression of color-coded blocks on a map. It is a fluid, incredibly dangerous game of adaptation where relying on someone else's technology can eventually erase your empire from the map entirely. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep exploring, keep questioning the mechanics of the history you think you know, and we'll catch you next time.